perfect test security storm in educational assessments. So I'm joined today by three Caveonites, Jennifer Miller from the Data Forensics team, Dennis Maines, our Chief Scientist, also from the Data Forensics team, and Steve Adicott, our Vice President of Sales. So welcome, guys, and Jennifer, I will turn the time over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. First of all, I just want to say thanks to everybody for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this webinar. We really appreciate the opportunity to give you our thoughts on this. Next slide. So I just want to quickly talk about the agenda today. First of all, as Jamie said, I'm going to be talking about, well, actually Jamie didn't say that, but nevertheless, I'm going to be talking about the elements of the perfect storm. And then I will be followed by Steve Adicott, who's going to be talking about the fallout from the storm. He'll talk about the potential consequences from the perfect storm if and when it does hit. And then finally, Dennis Maines is going to be talking about weathering the storm. In other words, how can states plan and protect themselves from the threats to state assessment that we're seeing? Next slide. So Caveon has a lot of experience with state assessments. We've worked with over 40 states. We perform security audits. We perform data forensics on the test response data for quite a number of states. We develop security plans for state assessment programs, and then we also investigate security breaches when they do occur. So we have quite a bit of experience, and then through this experience, we've seen a number of elements converging to create what we are referring to as the perfect test security storm in educational assessment. But before I talk about that, we want to get some feedback from the audience. I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, who's going to give a quick poll.
Okay, so our first question is, are security threats to state assessments increasing, decreasing, or remaining the same? What do you think? Go ahead and vote, and we'll watch the votes come in and let you know our poll results. So it looks like just about everybody has voted. Let's go ahead and close the poll, please, and show the results. So it looks like most state assessments, most people that are on the webinar today feel that there's an increase in security threats to state assessments. And a few of you out there are unsure. All right, Jennifer, let me turn it back to you.
Well, that is a quite a significant result. 92% of our audience feels that the threats are increasing. I think at Caveon here, we would agree with you. We might be a little biased, but we would agree. And we'll be talking about that some more during this webinar. So if you go to the next slide. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we're seeing a lot of elements coming together that are creating the perfect test security storm in educational assessments. And these elements include the fact that test scores are now tied to school funding. Also, performance evaluations for educators and upper-level administrators are also tied to student test scores. And then another element is that the responsibility of test security is being placed in the hands of the very people who are most motivated to cheat, or in other words, who stand to gain the most from cheating. And then finally, we're just seeing an overall increase in security threats and vulnerabilities to state assessment, which we see that from the poll that most of you agree with that. So next slide, please. So I just want to talk a minute about the No Child Left Behind Act. This act was signed in 2001, and as part of that, schools can qualify for what's referred to as Title I funding from the federal government if they have a certain percentage of students who are considered disadvantaged. And just to give you some perspective on that, about over half of the public schools in the United States qualify for Title I funding. So this is a large percentage of our schools that qualify or are getting Title I funding. And schools that receive this funding are required to demonstrate what's referred to as adequate yearly progress towards proficiency levels. And then depending on how the schools are meeting the adequate yearly progress goals, the federal funding is funneled towards those that are struggling. But if a school is receiving Title I funding, definition for adequate yearly progress, but they do this in coordination with the federal government. And then another piece of adequate yearly progress is that schools are held accountable for the performance of all the students within the school, not just the average performance of the students in the school, hence the No Child Left Behind. And then schools that do not meet adequate yearly progress for 2 years in a row are subject to immediate interventions. And these interventions can include something as such as technical assistance, or even something as severe as closure of the school or replacement of staff. So these schools are under a lot of pressure to keep their test scores high. Next slide. And then I just want to talk about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act Flexibility Waiver. And this was announced in 2011, which allows some flexibility for states in meeting the No Child Left Behind requirements. And part of being able to obtain this waiver, states have to develop very rigorous plans with how they are going to turn around schools that are struggling. And then also the waiver requires that student growth data be used as part of educator evaluation. So this can strengthen the connection between educator salaries and incentives and with student test scores. And then I just want to say before we move on, I've been talking about No Child Left Behind primarily here, but that is not the only connection between school funding and student performance. A lot of districts and states are also moving towards performance-based systems for funding. So in a lot of cases, whether the school is a Title I school or not, the educators are still under a lot of pressure to increase student test scores in order to obtain the much needed funding. Next slide, please. So an example of a school that was in trouble with regards to adequate yearly progress is Parks Middle School in Atlanta. Parks Middle School is part of the Atlanta Public School District. It was involved in the cheating scandal that emerged in 2009. And they were in quite a pickle in 2006 because they had been designated a school in need of improvement from 2001 to 2005. And so they were in a position in 2006 where unless 58% of their students passed the math portion of the assessment and 68% passed the language arts, the state was looking at potentially shutting down the school. Eventually, allegations of cheating in the Atlanta Public School District surfaced, and this prompted the governor to perform an investigation. And as part of that investigation, they found cheating in 44 Atlanta public schools, and there were almost 200 teachers potentially involved in that. Okay, next slide, please. So as part of that investigation, investigators found what they referred to as organized and systemic misconduct in the district, and said that administrators created a culture of fear, intimidation, and retaliation. And this is what ultimately led educators to cheat on the assessment. Next slide. So adding to the pressure that is put on teachers, states are moving towards performance-based compensation programs, and they're using test scores to evaluate teachers and they're linking those to their salaries and to any incentives the teachers may be obtaining. And so in addition to that, upper level administrators such as superintendents, their salaries and incentives are also being linked to student test scores, and they are in turn putting pressure on teachers to improve student scores. So teachers are kind of under a double burden in this respect, which just again adds to the pressure. Next slide. So in addition to teachers trying to maintain their jobs, there are also some teachers and educators have been able to use these performance-based systems for personal gain. And that was the case for Lorenzo Garcia, the superintendent of the El Paso Independent School District. He and his staff were accused of manipulating student roster data in order to discourage or prevent the lower performing students from taking the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills. And the TAGS is a test that's given in the 10th grade to students who will be graduating from high school. And what he and his staff were accused of doing is basically preventing the lower performing students from coming to class on the day of the test. And so only the higher performing students were allowed to take the test, and this ultimately artificially inflated the test scores. Some of the tactics that they used to do this were they actually transferred students to other schools. They reclassified students as sophomores or juniors to keep them out of, as freshmen or juniors to keep them out of the sophomore class. And then in some cases, they actually instructed students not to attend school on the day of the test. And so just to give you an example of that, Bowie High School, which is one school within the district, had 381 students in their freshman class in 2007. And in the following fall, in 2008, the sophomore class was only 170 students. So somewhere in that time frame, 211 students mysteriously disappeared. Garcia was ultimately convicted of manipulating data used to measure No Child Left Behind progress, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison and fined about $60,000, which is the amount he received in bonuses during his tenure. Next slide. So another element in the perfect test security storm is the fact that the security of state assessments is being placed in the hands of the teachers. And this is kind of like having the fox guard the hen house. Teachers are responsible for receiving the testing materials when they're shipped from the vendor. They're responsible for storing the materials in a secure location. They're responsible for proctoring the tests, and ultimately they're responsible for packaging the materials and shipping them back to the vendor for scoring. So basically, educators have custody of the testing materials throughout the entire testing process. And then also, if allegations of cheating do surface, often the states will turn to the districts and the teachers themselves to perform investigations into those allegations. And this creates an environment that is ripe for unethical behavior, and it makes it very difficult to detect that behavior if it does occur. Next slide. And teachers are really feeling the pressure, and this is evident from a survey that was given to educators in Michigan, where 29% of them felt pressure to cheat on standardized tests, 34% felt pressure to help their students, and 21% knew other educators who had helped their students, and then 8% of the teachers who were surveyed actually admitted to changing answer sheets themselves. So a lot of states are moving towards computer-based delivery of their assessment, and there's been a lot of discussion and debate around whether that's going to help with test security or whether it's going to hurt it or whether it's not going to make any difference at all. And so we want to get some feedback from the audience again on that. So Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. We have another poll for you.
Okay, so our next poll question is, does implementing CBT increase or decrease threats to state assessments? So the polls are now open, and you can go ahead and vote. Looks like we're just about there. Okay, let's go ahead and close the polls and show the results. Oh, I lost my screen here. Cindy, I think we lost I lost my screen anyway.
Mine got really, really tiny at the top left of the screen, but I've made it. I was able to make it bigger with the drag out thing.
Okay. Well, I'll just talk about the results of the poll. So about half of the group thinks that implementing computer-based testing actually decreases threats to state assessments. 15% say increase, and 38% say that they're unsure. So let me turn this back over to you, Jennifer.
All right.
Looks like we've got our screen back. So.
Okay, so we're good. We have the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. Okay, so basically what we're seeing is that overall the threats to test security are increasing. So for one, cheating technology is becoming more sophisticated. I could also, another way to say this is that the technology that enables people to harvest test content is becoming more sophisticated. So pictured down at the bottom of this slide is a pen which has a tiny lens on it. It's very difficult to see that lens, but someone can walk into a test session, and this goes for any test session, not just school assessments. And they can, you know, take pictures of the test as it comes up on the screen, or even paper and pencil. And this is just extremely difficult to detect, and it's just and it's widely available. You can go online and buy this pen for a few bucks, and you can steal test content with it. So that's adding to the increase in the threats to test security. But also what we're finding is that we have threats that are being introduced by computer-based testing. Some of these include hacking, so people can now hack into servers and obtain test content remotely. And then also a very big issue is the lengthening of test windows that's happening in states, because a lot of states do not have enough equipment for all of the students to take the test at the same time. And therefore they're having to lengthen the testing window in order to allow all the students access to the computers. And when you have a lengthened testing window, you have more time for students who've taken the test to then discuss the test content with other students who have not taken the test. And so you just have a lot more time available for security breaches to occur. Also, kind of adding to that is the fact that we now have the consortia, such as PARC and SBAC. And so what these consortia states are doing is they're developing a single test that is common among all the states within the particular consortium. And so when you have a single test common to all the states, and then you have lengthened testing windows among those states to allow students access to the computers, then you have a lot of time for people to be talking about the test content. And then you also have the potential for a very significant breach, because a security breach in this case would not affect just a single state. It would affect all of the states that are members of the consortium. And then finally, social media presents a great threat to test security, because if information is obtained, it can be easily distributed to a lot of people very quickly over social media. And then actually one way that this is happening, there's an anti-testing movement, and a lot of the some of the supporters have been encouraging students and educators to take pictures of the tests and post them on social media. There have been a couple of cases of this, and this is being viewed as an act of civil disobedience. But what it actually does is presents a big threat to the state assessments, particularly these states that are members of PARC and SBAC. And so next what I'm going to do is turn the time over to Steve Attica, and he's going to talk about the fallout from the storm, what happens if or when the storm hits, and we're on to you, Steve.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate you detailing all these different elements that have compounded together creating the storm. And so now let's explore the impact of these elements on students, on educators, on reputations. Also, I want to talk about when these things happen, the scandals that are created in the media, how long-lasting they are and how impactful they are. They're incredibly salacious, and particularly with electronic news media, a story that in the past might have just died, we see them resurrected time and time again. And then the last thing I want to talk about, let's go to the next slide, please. The last thing I want to talk about is the incredible financial toll the perfect storm takes on states and districts. So let's dive into each one of these. We're going to stay right here. But at the student level, it's sort of morally untenable that honorable students who work hard, study hard, can be so negatively impacted when either on their own or through the efforts of educators, some students gain unfair advantage. And really, this is even more important when we see struggling students who may not receive the extra attention and learning resources they're eligible for, because there's lots of studies that demonstrate how important, how efficacious remedial services can be in long-term student success when they're introduced at the right time. But so when students who are at risk miss those extra services because their scores are artificially inflated, it can lead to them never realizing the success they could. For educators, when an educator has crossed the line and tampered with answer sheets or provided some sort of unfair advantage, disclosed live test items, schools and districts, other schools and districts, miss out on funding because it's inappropriately allocated to the wrong school. And I get really heated up thinking about this. In Utah, we're in a state that has one of the lowest expenditures per student in the country. So every single dollar is absolutely precious. And when I consider that my kids may not get the resources their school deserves because some other principal or some other educator is doing the wrong thing, well, I really get frustrated at that prospect. So teachers and schools can be disadvantaged because their great work, or also can be disadvantaged when their efforts, their great work, aren't fairly compared with other teachers and educators because of possible malfeasance. From the dollar standpoint, the fact is that compromised items need to be replaced, and that is an incredibly expensive proposition. So in reality, taxpayers pay twice or 3 times or 4 times for something that really should only have been paid for once. And as I mentioned, the fact that we use the results for important decisions of where and how many state and federal dollars are allocated, we see misallocation of those resources due to test fraud. So let's go to the next slide, please. I just mentioned some of the direct impacts on students. I think there's another cost that's much harder to quantify. If you take a look at this quote, this is from an Atlanta Public Schools student, a few things really jump out at me. This student, Jen, talks about the tarnished school system from which she hails, and that her grades may not stand on their own. An entire system of perceived cheaters, and that it's no joke to overcome the perception of a morally bankrupt system. And if you look at this date, the 27th of October in 2014, she is still reeling, she is still feeling the effects of something that initially transpired 7 years before. And I think this raises all kinds of questions. How many kids in Atlanta, how many thousands of kids are similarly affected? Their confidence, their esteem. How many college admission officers question or are skeptical of applications from this particular district or districts involved in other cheating scandals? And then how many deserving kids miss out on opportunities not due to anything they've done, but due to the actions of crooks? It's really, really difficult situation to try to reconcile. Let's go to the next slide. So fallout from the storm, negative media attention. Make no mistake, a lot of the cheating scandals that we read about day in and day out result from good old-fashioned, dogged journalism. They play a huge role, journalists play a huge role in the creation of and impact of the perfect storm. This was reinforced for me personally in the last year when one of the state departments of education, rather, I work with very closely, had to deal with a situation where teachers at a middle school approached a journalist for the local paper, indicating that, hey, these kids from a top elementary school who scored highly proficient in elementary school when they left now don't know how to read. They can't write. They don't know what a period is. So the journalist published these allegations, and now the State Department of Education was forced very quickly to change its priorities, initiate an investigation, and contend with a very difficult situation. That's what we saw in Atlanta. This slide here, of course, the granddaddy of all cheating scandals. It initially evolved out of a series of articles published by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2008. The journalist said there might be something rotten here. The district poo-pooed those allegations. No, we're fine. There's nothing untoward going on. But article after article appeared to where the governor finally said enough. He appointed 2 special investigators who were supported by 60 agents of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and as Jennifer outlined, 10 months of investigation, $9 million spent, ultimately almost 200 educators flagged, 44 schools, and this has continued on just in the last month. The nationwide news articles continue as 11 individuals were convicted on conspiracy charges under the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. So let's go to the next slide. Another example of a state and school district sideswiped by a journalist. So in 2009, there's an online news publisher, The Notebook, hired a young new journalist. Editor gave that journalist the education beat and said, hey, go drum something up. This journalist began to sift through publicly available documentation and found some psychometric reports that indicated possible malfeasance in a number of Philadelphia-based schools, and published those articles. And as you can see on the slide, that began a series of investigations and very salacious reports month after month that finally resulted in 138 educators being implicated, lasted for years and years, and just in the last 6 months, or the last few months, 8 educators were actually charged with felonies. And it's not just Atlanta, it's not just Philadelphia. Next slide, please. We saw a similar situation in the District of Columbia, where the scandal began with a USA Today article. Ultimately, things got so uncomfortable and there was so much pressure that the district had to launch a formal procurement for external investigators at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars, multiple years. And in this case, had to publicly release a year's worth of proprietary test items. So all that test development investment, poof, gone. And we've seen similar kinds of scandals. There's one I just read about in Arizona. We've seen it in California. We've seen it in New Jersey, a number of different states. So next slide, please. I think now we want to launch a poll. And Jamie, you want to lead us through this?
Sure. So the question on this poll is, does your state have a budget specifically designed for test security? Just a simple yes or no. So we'll let people take their time to answer that. And we realize that not everybody is with a state assessment department. So if you are within an organization that does do testing, you can use the question to answer it for your own organization. Looks about voting is almost complete. We'll wait another second. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll and show the results. So about 20% do have test security. That's part of their budget. 30% do not, and about half of the group is not sure. And it could be, you know, as we were talking about preparing for this session yesterday, we said, well, you know, test security budget could come from other places. Sometimes you borrow from other places, and it may not be specifically allocated, but this at least gives us an idea of what the picture looks like. So, Steve, let me turn this back to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. But really, you're not turning it back to me because I'm turning it to Dennis. We've talked about what constitutes the perfect storm. We've talked about the devastation the perfect storm can yield. Dennis, what can a high-stakes test program do to weather the storm?
Well, I've had myself
I think
on
you're on.
Yeah, now I'm not muted. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Appreciate all that's been shared. So, you know, I'm just going to talk for a few minutes here about things you might do to weather the storm. I think we all understand how strong this can be and how it can come at you in different ways. And so I think first I've got listed here as budget resource allocation. And, you know, that's really the idea, is to balance your budget and resources against your needs. And part of this has to do with your core mission. You know, the core mission of states is to provide education. And in order to know whether that education is suitable or proper or appropriate, we have to measure it some way. And right now, we're using tests to do that. So when people sabotage the test by taking the items and sharing them on social media, it impacts your ability to measure. And the point is, if you have bad data, you'll have bad decisions. So the first thing to do is look at your resources, look at your budget, and decide how to allocate those things appropriately so you can maintain the integrity of your program. The next one that I want to talk about briefly is strategy. I think strategy is often overlooked. And so I'll talk about that in a little more detail in the next slide. And then I want to talk about putting together a comprehensive program and some of the ideas that we have learned here that we think will help you. Let's go forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of strategy, there are a lot of elements of strategy. So I just want to focus on these four for right now. And that is, if you look at your mission statement, there are a lot of people who seem to be confused about what schools and assessment, the educational system is all about. And I think the better you can tie measurement, assessment into that mission, and the importance of having valid assessments, that are administered with integrity, that the scores actually measure what they're supposed to measure, the stronger you have a statement for supporting test security. And, you know, unfortunately, even within the education system, there are people who feel like, well, maybe the test isn't that important. And so that's part of what has to happen with evangelizing this, so people understand why you're doing test security. This is not about catching people who are doing bad things. It's about ensuring the tests measure what they're supposed to measure and ensuring that you can make good decisions and letting people know that. Now, part of this, we talked about threats, we talked about computer-based testing and how there are new threats and new vulnerabilities as a result of that. And yeah, some of the old threats and old vulnerabilities, like having pizza parties with answer sheet documents and erasing, those go away because the answer sheet documents are no longer available. So, but we will have new vulnerabilities, and we have this mix. We have to understand what the threats and the vulnerabilities are. And these are always going to evolve. So part of this idea of strategy is understanding how this landscape changes and what you have to do. Now, obviously, resources are critical here. You know, training people, making sure they know what to do, making sure that you appropriately leverage vendor resources and strengths, and use the strengths within the department to manage this issue and make sure that you've got what you need in terms of test security. And last, the communications plan. I don't think I can underemphasize the importance of having a really good communications plan in place. And the communications, definitely state departments of education have been sideswiped by public outcry, by media frenzy, and being able to weather that storm with a good communications plan is just critical. And having that communication plan comes from being prepared. Having your mission and vision statements in place so you can communicate and share succinctly why you're doing this, what you're doing, and how you're doing it. And part of the communication plan is being able to communicate what your goals are. And, you know, I see things in the paper often like, well, you know, we have zero tolerance for cheating. You know, I really cringe when I hear a statement like that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the focus and emphasis should be on the score validity, not on behavior. That's what we're trying to ensure that you have valid scores. So that's what we need to communicate. It's not about cheating. It's about scores and what the scores measure, what they're supposed to measure. The other reason I cringe when I hear a statement like that is zero tolerance means, oh, we are going to find and catch every single person who potentially cheated. Well, that might not be realistic. It probably is not reasonable. You know, I can tell you exactly, being a statistician, how I can do that. I can guarantee I can catch every single cheater, because I will say everyone is a cheater. There, I've caught them all. That's not realistic. It's not reasonable. So you have to balance things here in terms of prioritizing and making sure that you focus on what's critical. Okay, next slide, please. So it's really important to have a comprehensive program. So we talked about strategy in the previous slide, and I had the picture of the chess player, you know, planning moves. That's what, in order to know the moves, you need to know tactics. You need to know what your overall plan is and how you're going to pursue that. We like to talk about test security in 4 areas: protection, detection, response, improvement. We say test security is a process It's not a state. And the process involves doing all of those things on a continual basis. I have at home a security system. Just because I have a security system doesn't mean that my home is protected or that I'm detecting intruders or I know how to respond, because that security system has to be armed, it has to be tested, it has to be monitored, and it has to have be serviced. All of those things are critical for making, and that's only one part of my security plan in my home. And I have to do all of these things. It's a process. You need to do all of these. Let's go forward here. Next slide. So here's our comprehensive program we're going to suggest to you. And I know we're high level. We're not down in the details, but I'll provide some detailed thinking here about this also. And that is protect, detect, respond, improve. So protection is all about preventing test security breaches, or if they occur, making sure you can respond to them quickly, making sure that you're adequately covered so you can take action. So we are seeing in the states legislation being introduced to allow states to take action. For example, legislation that allows a state to subpoena documents from schools if an investigation is required. You know, if you don't have that ability, it's rather hard to actually do the full investigation. Part of protection is training, making sure that the exams are copyrighted, making sure you have the proper controls in place for physical and information security. All of those things are important for protection. And in terms of detection, you know, we like to talk about 5 things. First of those are proctoring, what's happening as the test is administered. Of course, it's a best practice to have 2 people in a room at the same time. But if those 2 people are in collusion, 2 adults, to violate the security of the exam, you have a problem, which is why you want to look at data and analyze data and look at statistics. And you want to have tip lines in place. You want to have a monitoring program in place that allows you to go and observe. And you need to be looking on the internet for questions that have been harvested and shared through social media or other ways. Those are all important elements of detection that you cannot and should not ignore. And in terms of response, you know, there are several things that you should do. First of all, you need a plan in place for responding to incidents. We call that a security incident response plan. And because when the fire is burning, it's too late to try and dig a well to put the fire out. You really need to be ready and able to have your teams act in a position that you can activate them to respond to this incident. You need ways to investigate, whether they're done internally or externally, and you need to think through how those investigations are handled. And you definitely, in the response, need to be able to talk about communications and how you're going to communicate with the public, the media, with stakeholders, with districts, with schools, everything that goes on as you respond to potential security problems. And definitely you have to think about sanctions. Does that mean that you withhold the scores or the AYP status for a school for a year or 2? Could definitely be part of the sanction. And there could be other sanctions. I don't think we have time to talk about all of those. But those are all elements of your security, comprehensive security program. And last, I want to talk about improvement. Improvement is critical. It feeds back into these 3 other main areas. And part of that is doing audits of your test security, continuing to be educated and learn, like this webinar today, or conferences and training. All of those things are improved. But most importantly, I think, maybe not most important, but without being able to do metrics and look at the data and look at what's happening and whether or not you have issues, whether things are peaceful or whether the barometer is low and you have a storm brewing, you need metrics. And you need to be able to follow up with what you measure in order to understand what went wrong, where you failed. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, has a stellar record for improving security of airline travel in this country. And the way they do that is they investigate every single incident. What went wrong? Was it a human failure? Was it mechanical failure? What kinds of things do we need to do here? And there's a lot of knowledge that can be learned and gleaned by appropriately digging into test security breaches and the things and incidents and those things that happen. Okay, next slide, please. So I think this quote is really critical. You know, we have a lot of reasons for people to cheat. And one of the problems we have here is that teachers are insiders. They are perfectly placed to, if they decide to breach the security, to do so, and often without this being detected. So you need tools in place to help that. And these cores are so critical, but they're being used for a lot of areas, and that's why we have to really pay attention to what we've got here. And it just all comes down to success or failure that's appropriate. Let's go forward. Next slide, please. So we have produced, as Jamie mentioned, a white paper that talks about these issues, talks about a lot of the things we've discussed today. We think it will be really helpful. So we are going to, I think we have a question, so let us know whether you would like a copy of these or not.
So we've opened the poll again, and go ahead and let us know if you'd like a copy of this paper. And as I mentioned, when we are at NCSA towards the end of June, we will have copies of the paper there. And if you'd like to stop, if you're going to be at the conference and would like to stop by the booth and pick one up, please do. So let's see how we're doing on our poll here. Just about, I'll give it another second, let people respond. It looks like we can go ahead and close out the polls. We have a number of folks who do want it, and those of you who choose not to take advantage of getting the paper, we will not send it to you. So I know that we have time now for a few questions, and I've got one question that I can start with. And this is, let me open this up here. So our first question, this one's geared towards Dennis, is what do you recommend when a state has no control over the LEA employees and there seems to be a disconnect to prevent meaningful efforts to develop a comprehensive program? And I take that to mean a test security program.
Yeah, that's a really good point, a really good question. And that's one of the, so you have to have levers. You have to be able to act. And you have to look at within your state how you can act and how you can sanction. If you don't have those abilities at all, it may be time to go to the legislature and make sure that you have, your Department of Education has authority to act. The department should have authority to investigate. There's a Professional Standards Commission that you should have the authority to take an educator and put that license up for consideration before that commission. You know, there are a lot of things you should be able to do, and I guess I would recommend, first of all, talk to your state colleagues when you go to NCSA or other places, find out what they're doing, find out what they have available. And there's definitely best practices. And the TILSA, boy, my memory is not the best anymore, Steve. What's TILSA? Technology Issue Large-Scale Assessment. A subcommittee of the Chief Council of State School Officers has produced a book, monograph, Operational Best Practices, and they talk about these kinds of issues. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Dennis. I've got another, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, just along those lines, one state with which we're familiar lacked some of those levers when it came to an investigation. They lacked subpoena power in conducting the investigation. So this year, they went to the state legislature, and the legislature passed a law that provides that empowers the state with subpoena power. So we do see that these changes can be implemented.
Thanks, Steve. I've got another question, and this is a great one. How have states typically handled civil disobedience of posting or reposting text items on social media? I know this is kind of a new phenomenon that we're seeing. What are some of your thoughts there?
Steve, why don't you go ahead and answer that question?
Well, I think one of the key things, you have to know when these things are posted, so there has to be some sort of web monitoring process in place. Whether you do it on your own, whether you hire someone to do that for you, you have to stay on top of these things. And then when they are posted, most of the social media sites do not want copyrighted material inappropriately shared. And so if you take the steps necessary to reach out to them, very quickly you can have that content removed. As far as the grassroots efforts to maybe try to change perceptions and educate folks, that's a tougher challenge for sure. And I think that some of the industry groups we see, Conference of Test Security, the National Conference of Student Assessment, the ATP conference, those are the kinds of issues that can be tackled with your peers at those venues or at venues like that. Anything else to add, Dennis?
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on this. You know, I think you have to be aggressive in the media with this. This is not civil disobedience. This is, let's call it what it is. It's copyright infringement, and it is sabotage to the test. And it's sabotage to the educational program. You have to take control of that message. I know you have to do it appropriately, right? You have smart people think through how to do this in the right way. But that's the general message that needs to be out there. And let the public know that this is not about, oh, you know, I'm going to jaywalk because there needs to be a crosswalk here. It's not this kind of thing at all. There are impacts. You know, we talked about impacts of the when people disrupted testing. You know, and there's impacts to taxpayer dollars. Definitely impacts here. You know, you could, and I think, you know, you don't want to fearmonger. You definitely need people to understand what responsibility is, and it needs to be taught to the students that they need to be responsible. They need to act like responsible people. That's part of education also.
Thanks, Dennis and Steve. Just a note from one of our attendees that the social media monitoring is recommended in the operational best practices from CCSSO. So you can kind of look in there. I think it's also mentioned in the TILSA guidebook. So
yeah, operational best practices is from ATP CCSSO collaborative effort.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, well, it looks like we are just about out of time for today. Let's go to our last slide. And I just want to thank our presenters today for this collaborative effort in talking about the perfect storm, how it gets generated, what the results of it are, and what we can do to prevent it. If you have any questions or you want to contact our presenters directly, their emails are listed below or listed on the slide. And as I mentioned, the session is being recorded, so you will get a copy of both the recording as well as the slides. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to having you on our webinars in the future.